Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a hometown scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Clemens Railroad Wreck. Hello there. Grays Harbor is not a railroad town in the sense of the small towns of the Middle West that live and are built around the railroad tracks. There's something about the railroads of our country, their historic importance to the building of the West, that created communities dependent on the iron horse. The tracks divided the town socially and economically, and the whistle of the train in the night is a sound that grows close to the heart of Midwestern people, and they miss it, probably most of all, when they are transplanted from their native lands. I remember the situation that arose in the South Pacific during the war years when our division withdrew from Guadalcanal and moved down to the little land of New Zealand for rest and rehabilitation. We built camps in the southern part of the North Island, nearly a dozen of them, and out in the softly rolling hills were the sheep paddocks, provided clear lands for tents and huts. We established 3 camps. The current motion picture Sands of Iwo Jima depicted one of them and left me homesick for the fields of lupin and the dense brush, because it happened that I laid out that camp on paper one day in December 1942, and it was like a look at an old home. But it was in these camps that the tried, battle-worn veterans of Guadalcanal came to rest and get a feel of sunlight and a taste of real food. And between the camps, the little New Zealand railroad train, narrow gauge and tiny by our standards, rattled between Wellington and Auckland. And one day, the division chaplain, who had a keen insight into the things that weigh heavy on men's minds, arranged with the railroad to have its trains whistle for the crossing about a half a mile down the tracks, and McKay's Crossing a half mile north of the track. There were 2 whistles at night, and he even arranged for the 2 longs and 2 shorts that the big mallets blow when they are approaching a whistle stop in the Great Plains states. And it was the most important thing that he did, for the boys lying, what Marines call in the sack, that whistle in the night was the next thing to a trip home that they had experienced. But we are a little bit off the subject that we started to find in our scrapbook. We're going to tell you the story of Grays Harbor's worst and only bad railroad disaster, the one that happened suddenly and without warning, the night of December 12th, 1921. No, Grays Harbor is not a railroad center, as Midwest towns can claim, but for logging railroads, well, we're about as near to the middle of things as a community can become. For the logging railroads are the arteries of our major commerce, and down the tracks of the logging roads that link our industries with the forest come the produce of our tree-growing lands. Yes, if it's logging railroads, Grays Harbor can hold its own with the best of them. The Clemens Logging Company was working a show south of the Chehalis River and just east of Melbourne, and they had put in a stretch of new line the spring before to a new camp set back in the timber. There were some heavy cuts and fills in the steep hillsides, and the road had been built with some difficulty, but engineers called it sound, and a lot of logs had been moved over the line during the summer and autumn. Then came December 1921. Gerald Willis of Melbourne was only 26 years old. He had already been shown himself as a dependable hand with the Clemens Company and had been piloting one of the company's locomotives on the logging railroad. He was married, had a 2-year-old daughter, and was a solid citizen. He was, if you asked the foreman, one of the new generation of loggers, a family man, settled and ambitious, in contrast to the drifters who had pioneered the Grays Harbor woods, working between Christmas and the 4th of July, and shooting their wad in one grand bust twice a year, with the accent on the glorious 4th. Willis had been down to Montesano over Sunday, and that evening he had arranged to run his locomotive back to the camp with a string of empties. He had to wait until 7 o'clock time for the train to clear the tracks. It was running back to the camp with about 50 men of the camp crew. Then Willis hooked onto the string of flat cars, and with his wife and daughter in the cab with him, and with A.W. Hussey as brakeman and Ira Elliott as fireman, he started for the camp, about 8 miles southeast of Montesano. It had been a rainy day that December, about like our past month. Not much different than most of these months that put an ample topping on Grays Harbor annual rainfall. For weeks the forest had been pelted with rain, and the streams were high and in places over their banks. So Willis took it slowly as he worked his way along the grades up the slopes of the rail lines. It was growing late. He was determined not to hurry. Visibility was poor, and there was always a chance of a slide on the line. Still, there had been no word of the 7 o'clock camp train being held up, so he didn't anticipate trouble. The last train out of Melbourne on the Clemens track was working its way along the lightest point of the line, about 8 miles southeast of the junction. It was at a spot where the grade had been cut sharply into a towering hill that loomed above it, and a valley dropway along the other side, 5 to 1,000 feet. Elliot had just fired the boiler and was standing back in the cab. The headlight shone dimly ahead of the engine and disclosed a clear track, but Willis kept his puffing locomotive under control and moved slowly. He was playing it safe. But there was danger ahead. We'll tell you more about this in this yarn after a few words from Dick Crombie and our sponsor. Then, as they moved along, suddenly, as Elliot later recalled, there was a sinking feeling. The earth seemed to drop away from beneath the engine. The door of the firebox swung open, and in its light, he could see Engineer Willis making a frantic grab for his wife and child. Then the cab seemed to swing through the space. Elliot leaped into the darkness, but as he made his jump, he saw the boiler of the engine sliding back on the helpless engineer, his wife, and his child. As the fireman jumped the cab, swinging, he caught his hand and severed 2 fingers, and as he struck the muddy slopes of the hill, he saw the flashes of fires as the engine tumbled below him. He felt the earth moving beneath him, heard the rumble and the tumble of cars and the hiss of steam. Where Hussey, the brakeman, was, he could only guess as the cars were dragged down the slope behind the tumbling engine. For a few minutes, the injured fireman lay on the water-soaked hillside. Then, as his strength returned, he climbed the loose slope of the hill to the track where the stubs of rails clung to their ties, hanging in space. He regained the track and began to run towards the camp. The rain beat on him, but he trotted on, then began to run frantically, stumbling over the ties in the darkness. He staggered into the camp with blood dripping from his injured hands. Coated with mud, hatless, his eyes wide with terror that he had experienced. In a matter of a few minutes, the 40-man camp crew that had arrived on the 7 o'clock train, but a few minutes before, was on its way back to do a rescue. They came up the muddy slopes, armed with tools to effect a rescue, their lanterns making ghostly sparks in the rain-soaked darkness. Ernest Olson, 30, of Montesano, a friend of the locomotive engineer, led the party down the slope. But as they began to move down the steep incline, sinking into their knees in the soft, water-soaked soil, someone shouted, "It's sliding again!" The men swarmed off the slope like ants driven from a hill, but not all of them. Olson was caught by the rushing earth. W.T. Label of Hoquiam disappeared in the moving mass. John Lind was swept along with it, and below them the locomotive that had stopped some 200 feet down the hill began to slide towards the bottom of the canyon. It was daylight before the crew could make their headway in their work, but long before that time they had discovered Hussey the brakeman, his broken legs and his hands and legs badly burnt. From the camp, a phone call to Montesano had started Dr. Coulter on his errand of mercy. It was 3 a.m. when the doctor left his house and started into the cold, wet night. He found the Chehalis over its bank and crossed the river on the railroad bridge. At one point he borrowed a boat at a farmhouse, and in other places he waded hip-deep through the swirling brown waters to gain access to the railroad tracks where the speeder was to meet him and take him to the camp. Hardly had the work of the rescue crew began, then a third slide endangered the workers, and again the crews withdrew until the earth had stabilized. Willis's body was found near his cab, half covered in earth. One by one, others were discovered. But the hunt for the missing continued for days under the supervision of Arthur Elmgren, the road construction contractor, until they were finally all accounted for. It had taken weeks for the body of Mrs. Willis to be located, until most of the crew had returned to their work. Then searchers under Elmgren brought up a tattered piece of cloth. When probing the slide with their long poles, they dug into the hillside 7 feet to find the body of Pearl Willis. Throughout the searching operations, the rains continued to fall, and rail connections with the outside were interrupted as the Northern Pacific Railroad tracks were blocked in 3 places. Further slides crossed the logging camps' roads, and crews worked only under the greatest difficulties, but finally the wreckage was cleared. The car salvaged, and the engine pulled up the grade and rebuilt for further use. The track was rebuilt at the big slide, but the scar on the face of the hill remained for years as a landmark of Grays Harbor's worst railroad disaster, which had a climax and had claimed 6 lives. I have talked with a few old-timers about the tragedy that struck without warning on the Clemens Railroad the night of December 12, 1921, and many had forgotten the disaster, but none of those who worked in the wet darkness of that December night have forgotten a single detail. And there are still many who call Grays Harbor home, who participated in the rescue work that followed the railroad accident, and who recalled distinctly the sliding mountain of earth that caused the disaster and that have made tragic headlines on Grays Harbor for nearly 30 years. And as Grays Harbor's major railroad accident, we recorded tonight as a somber addition to our Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.